Opening the center allows immediate piece development and creates attacking chances. Embracing the center directly mirrors white's ambition, setting up a fundamental pawn duel for central dominion. Instantly developing a piece and targeting the central pawn prepares for rapid development and potential attacks. Developing a knight to c6 immediately defends the e5 pawn while bringing a piece into the game, a sound and natural response. Initiating the Lopez, this bishop launch subtly pressures black's knight, hinting at future central pawn advances and potential kingside threats. Challenging the bishop's influence, this knight's advance boldly questions white's spatial ambitions. Safeguarding the monarch, this maneuver secures the king and prepares for central action, inviting black to reveal their intentions. Boldly challenging white's center, this captures a pawn but opens lines and invites immediate counterplay, a double-edged sword. Aggressively seizing central control, this thrust opens vital diagonals and challenges black's daring knight advance, forcing immediate strategic decisions. Relocating the knight to d6 bravely challenges the bishop's presence and prepares to counterattack the center. Breaking the symmetry of the knight exchange creates an immediate structural imbalance, potentially weakening black's pawn chain while opening lines for white's pieces toward the king side. Opening the c-file for your rook feels like a tempting promise, but be wary of the queen's pawn suddenly becoming a permanent weakness and a target. Black's pawn structure is now compromised, creating a potential long-term disadvantage that white can exploit. Consider how this double's pawn might hinder piece development and control of central squares down the line. Opening a central diagonal for the queen and bishop, white now aims to exploit black's slightly displaced knight and underdeveloped kingside, creating long-term structural weaknesses in the process. Unleashing the knight to f5 immediately challenges the pawn on e5 and reestablishes piece activity, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially create attacking avenues toward the kingside. Initiating a queen exchange often signals a transition towards simplified, perhaps tactical, play. This forces black to confront the immediate consequence of their pawn structure's weakness. Relinquishing the castled haven, the black king bravely ventures into the center, embracing the challenges of an early open game. Developing the knight to c3 efficiently reinforces control of the center and prepares for further piece activation, anticipating a potential pawn push. Relocating the monarch to e8 liberates the d8 square, potentially for a rook's redeployment, and prepares to contest the semi-open d-file, but it surrenders the crucial e6 outpost to white's control and slightly restricts the queen's bishop's future mobility. Recentralizing the knight offers a flexible approach, preparing to challenge black's d6 pawn or redeploy to a more aggressive square like g3 or f4, while simultaneously shoring up white's kingside and potentially controlling key diagonals. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, it eyes the d5 square and aims to support the knight's potential advance, while also preparing to contest control of the central dark squares that have become somewhat exposed. Shifting the knight to f4 aims to bolster the e5 pawn and potentially launch an attack down the h-file if the opportunity arises, while also preparing for a central pawn advance like c4. Developing the bishop to d5 effectively challenges white's advanced knight and aims to gain space in the center, potentially preparing for a pawn push later. Liberating the knight from its knightly duties on f3, this exchange offers a slight simplification of the pawn structure, potentially easing the path towards an endgame where black's kingside pawn majority might become a concern. The pawn structure is fundamentally altered. This recapture resolves the immediate pawn tension on the e-file, opening lines for the rooks and creating a slightly more complex pawn island for black on the queen side. Aggressively pushing the kingside pawn forward aims to disrupt black's development and gain more central space, though it does create a potential weakness on the light squares. Retreating the knight to e7 now concedes crucial central space, a difficult concession given white's already dominating pawn on e5 and the pressure black faces on the kingside. Targeting the weak pawns on black's queen side and reinforcing the central space simultaneously, This maneuver seeks to activate the bishop from its passive square and prepare for potential pawn pushes like c4 to further restrict black's pieces. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain, black solidifies their structure but concedes considerable space to white's initiative, potentially limiting maneuverability for their pieces in the center and kingside. Reclaiming the central file now that the queens have departed becomes the immediate priority, preparing to challenge black's isolated pawn structure and pressure its weakened king position. The knight finds a more active square, eyeing the e5 pawn and preparing to reinforce the kingside should the opportunity arise, while simultaneously creating potential for a future exchange on f4 to alleviate the queenside's space disadvantage. Sharpening the bishop's influence on the long diagonal, 16. bg3 is a proactive repositioning, aiming to control the c7 pawn and create threats against black's potentially weak queenside structure while simultaneously preparing for a potential queenside expansion or consolidation. A crucial repositioning of the bishop, swinging it towards the queenside to potentially pressure white's advanced pawns and establish a more active diagonal presence. Solidifying the central pawn structure now, white aims to prevent black's active pieces from finding more comfortable squares, particularly that intruding knight on e7. Navigating the cramped space on the kingside, the knight retreats to f8, a seemingly passive maneuver that paradoxically aims to alleviate pressure and prepare for future queenside counterplay by freeing up the g6 square. Pushing the queenside pawns, this maneuver aims to seize more territory and potentially create a passed pawn, while also forcing black's bishop to consider its placement under pressure. Bringing the bishop back to b6 solidifies the pawn chain on the queenside and prepares for potential queenside expansion, aiming to undermine white's central control by creating pressure on the c3 pawn. Safeguarding the monarch from potential kingside threats becomes paramount now, consolidating the king's position before further material maneuvering begins. Bringing the knight back to the e6 square initiates a thoughtful regrouping, aiming to consolidate the piece's position after its adventurous foray to f5 and the subsequent exchange of queens. This development seeks to establish a more stable anchor in the center, potentially preparing for future advances or defensive maneuvers. It's a move that emphasizes patience and positional finesse, as black endeavors to improve the placement of their remaining active pieces in this complex, slightly unbalanced endgame. The knight's leap to the edge of the board initiates a complex maneuvering sequence, aiming to redeploy this piece to more active squares or to provoke weaknesses in black's pawn structure by creating potential forks or exchanges on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside offers dynamism, but leaves your own king's defenses somewhat exposed. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure, this move prepares to expand operations on the queenside or solidify defensive lines, while acknowledging the potential vulnerability created by the advance of the h-pawn. Opening the h-file now is a bold assertion of intent, immediately challenging the pawn structure and seeking to exploit the king's current position, though it does leave black's own monarch somewhat exposed as well. Opening up the h-file dramatically escalates the battle for kingside territory. White's pawn structure is now irrevocably altered, potentially creating weaknesses that black can exploit later. The pawn push to g6 is a defensive reaction, but it weakens the dark squares around the king considerably and gives white's knight a potential outpost on f5 if black isn't careful, opening up lines for white's bishop to potentially infiltrate the kingside. Unlocking the h-file, white prepares to challenge the opponent's centralized king and potential pawn weaknesses. A calculated regrouping effort, the bishop pivots to the d8 square, seeking a more secure haven away from the pressure cooker on the kingside, while simultaneously aiming to unblock the rook's path along the d-file. Initiating a targeted strike on black's weakened kingside, the knight repositions to a square that simultaneously pressures the f7 pawn and prepares for potential pawn pushes. Sacrificing the rook here initiates a radical shift, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated pawn structure and open lines for counterplay, even if it means accepting a material deficit in the short term. The knight's sudden plunge to d6, a sharp tactical thrust, forcefully disrupts black's recently stabilized position and immediately creates overwhelming pressure. A bold decision, deliberately sacrificing pawn structure integrity by accepting the doubled pawns on the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially generate counterplay on the queen side in the long run. The rook now claims the open file, transforming a static pawn chain into a dynamic attacking lever. Challenging the central pawn chain and aiming to disrupt white's imposing rook on the open file is a vital, albeit risky, endeavor. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm are the immediate goals now, leveraging the open f-file. Black is solidifying the king's escape route, subtly reinforcing the 8th rank by bringing the king off the potentially exposed d-file and towards a safer corner. Opening up a dangerous path for the f-pawn, this advance aims to disrupt black's central control and potentially exploit the now weakened squares around the king. Acknowledging the immense pressure on the king's side, black seeks to re-establish some defensive equilibrium by repositioning the knight to a less exposed square, unleashing the pawn's potential to disrupt black's defensive structure. Abandoning the pawn on e6 is a bold gambit, surrendering crucial central space for a fleeting glimmer of activity. Unleashing the knight into the enemy camp, this aggressive maneuver targets the weakened dark squares around black's king, creating immediate attacking possibilities and forcing a defensive reaction from black. The bishop retreats to its starting square, seemingly a safe haven, but it surrenders control of the crucial central squares and abandons the defense of the d-pawn, allowing white's rook to establish dominance on the now open file. Focusing on centralizing the bishop, this maneuver aims to bolster the pawn structure and prevent the black king from finding refuge on the d-file, while simultaneously eyeing weaknesses around the f6 square. Abandoning the cramped queenside is a pragmatic choice here, sacrificing a pawn to gain critical breathing room and activate the rook. The bishop lands on d6, a bold probe into black's weakened king's defense, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal and potentially disrupt any coordinated piece play black might be trying to muster around their still exposed monarch. Reclaiming central space with the rook presents an immediate challenge, forcing white to reassess their aggressive pawn thrusts. Capturing the knight opens the bishop's diagonal, but it simultaneously concedes the important e-file to black's rook and creates a passed pawn on the 5th rank for black, a significant endgame advantage. The rook's relocation to the 7th rank initiates a subtle but crucial endgame transition, aiming to reclaim lost pawn structure and disrupt white's potentially dominant knight placement by exchanging heavy pieces. The knight's journey to the outpost at d8 is a bold declaration, aiming to disrupt black's fragile pawn structure and exploit the open lines that white has painstakingly carved out. The pawn structure is now permanently fractured, a consequence of the earlier aggressive exchanges, and the rook's repositioning here offers little immediate solace, instead anchoring it to a potentially vulnerable square while white's pieces orchestrate a tightening noose. Clearing the path for the knight to become an unstoppable force on the queen side, this capture now isolates black's pawns and begins to exert significant pressure. Reclaiming a central pawn and activating the knight in the thick of it, black's knight makes a daring leap to the seemingly exposed e6 square. This audacious maneuver aims to disrupt white's coordinated piece pressure and potentially create threats of its own, offering a spark of life in an otherwise suffocating position. Clearing the path opens a vital invasion route for the knight, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure around black's king. Reclaiming the pawn on e6 stabilizes black's pawn structure, crucial for the impending endgame where pawns will become paramount. Seizing upon the open file and the exposed nature of black's queenside pawns, white boldly ventures the knight to a7, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create further weaknesses while the knight becomes an active attacking piece.